it?
I can't. Well, delighted. So this is just a sample. All the cases are in there. You'll tell us.
Okay, but
So during this whole pandemic, the struggle has been to provide each of us with the equipment and with clean equipment.
we have to make sure that our folks are protected. So these are 55,000 face masks. And you'll tell me how they go on,
There,
right?
that's perfect.
Like this. So we got 50,000 of these for our nurses and respiratory therapists. We got 1 million face masks, like this, surgical face masks. And we have close to 500,000 N95s.
In a time where our country needs leadership, I think our union has led the way to showing the concern and the support frontline workers need.
And this is only, wow.
Wow is right.
So many of our leaders and our members who were just crying out in, you know, as hospitals were peaking for having this protective equipment, the N95s, so that they could work, and seeing that the federal government just basically fell down on the job and further worsened what is a terrible virus.
It is inexcusable not to have these essentials. So our union has made that possible. And today is a special day to welcome these much needed supplies.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second day of the AFT's 86th annual or 86th biannual conference, and the first one we've ever done virtually. I wanted to start with that because I wanted to actually take a moment. Many of you know that I am from the UFT. I was its lawyer, you know, in the years since when dinosaurs roamed. In the 1980s, I was a teacher in New York City at Clara Barton High School in Crown Heights. But, you know, the UFT holds, not just because of COVID, just holds a very special place in my heart. And one of the things I wanted to do today was that, you know, there are lots of things that happened in March, April, and May. And one of the things that happened was that the UFT, the Federation of Nurses and Health Professionals, which is the kind of chapter of nurses and health professionals that is in the UFT. It's not a separate local, it's in the UFT. Its leader, Ann Goldman, who you saw in this film or this video, Ann and I met together, or met each other, back, I think, in February 1986, when I started working for the UFT as its lawyer. And in that time, my first assignment was to work as the assistant negotiator under Ann for the Lutheran Hospital negotiations. And at that time, we were fighting, Ann will remember this better than I, for nurse-to-patient ratios, safety in the workplace, decent wages. What a shock. There was a nursing shortage at that time. And that was the first strike that I was involved with as an employee at the UFT. We struck for several days at Lutheran Hospital in Brooklyn and Staten. I think it was just in Brooklyn at that moment. But nurses in our union, private and public, have been working to help create safe conditions for themselves and patients for decades. And in fact, Ann Goldman and people like Tom Pappas and Ellie Engler, we started a health and safety department at the UFT back in the 1980s. And Ann really focused on, we need to get this PPE, made sure that people had PPE throughout the time in May, in April, in May, in June. And Ann Goldman and the nurses in New York, from 9/11, Superstorm Sandy, asbestos crises, to now, have been out there front and center, making sure that we keep our members safe and keep the communities in which we serve safe. And I just wanted to say thank you to Ann and to our members in New York for all that they have done, our health and safety members. Right now, they're actually doing the videos for the New York City Board of Education on hand washing and on properly wearing masks. And so I just really wanted to take a moment of personal privilege to say thank you. And the video you saw was one of the shipments that we got of face shields, and Ann and I were there at the Bronx UFT office to accept that shipment. So with that, thank you, Ann, thank you, the members in New York City. I'm really excited about the programming that we also have, the other programming we have for today, and we're having a conversation, on all of these crises. And today we're going to have a conversation about the racial reckoning that we must do. But before that, I just want to make sure you know we have Anand Giridharadas, who is the writer of a book that has really moved me. It's still on my bookshelf, and we're going to be talking about that book. It's called Winners Take All, and talking about what really is going on in terms of the inequality in America between rich and everyone else. Speaker Pelosi will be joining us today as well. But before that, we are talking about racism in America and Black Lives Matter. And, you could wonder why a white woman is opening up the conversation about Black lives and racism instead of an AFT leader who is Black. And I could do the easy way out and say, well, that's because I'm the AFT president, and on something that's really important, I should lead the conversation. But I want to actually go deeper than that, which is what many of us should be doing, which is, as a white person, I have privileges that people of color do not. As I've said before, I'm also gay, but I could hide that, and I did for years and years and years. But as white people, we have to understand our responsibility in acknowledging white privilege and acknowledging that if we're walking into a store, we get a benefit of the doubt that a Black person does not get. Slavery is not only one of America's original sins, but frankly, the Civil War did not end the deprivation and the discrimination for Black people or of Black people. We see it or saw it, and Reverend Barber and Reverend King and others have talked about this for decades. Lynchings, Jim Crow, mass incarceration. These are all the remnants of slavery. And that's why white silence must stop. This should not just be a fight that our Black brothers and sisters have to do themselves. It is a fight that all of us need to do. And indeed, white silence has been complicit in discrimination. That's why I wanted to be moderating this panel. It's time to own our responsibility to push for an anti-racist America. And the best way to start that is to actually take a moment to remember our brother, Congressman John Lewis. Congressman Lewis taught us how to be justice warriors. He taught us how to fight for freedom, how to sacrifice for justice, how to build a community, a loving community that works towards a better life for all. So many of us have used the term good trouble because he taught us that. And he taught us how to engage in that. as did Dr. King, peacefully and nonviolently. He was a giant in every sense of the word, and all of us who work to repair the world owe him an enormous debt. As we continue on our journey for justice, we must hold him dear in our consciousness and our conscience. His bravery, his humility, and his steadfast belief in the power of action and action for justice, for good trouble. In my religion, we say, may his memory be for a blessing. His memory, and he is a blessing. Please, let's just look at the video, and then I'll introduce the panel.
He has dedicated his life to protecting human rights, civil liberties, and building what he calls the beloved community in America. A community of justice, a community of peace with itself. Please give an AFT welcome to Congressman John Lewis.
How you doing, Madam President?
How are you?
Good to see you.
Sojourner of truth.
Thank you. I must tell you that I'm delighted and very happy to be here. To be here in the House of Education. To be here in the House of Labor. To say to each and every one of you, thank you for all of your good and great work. To tell you to never give up. To never give in. To never give out. To keep the faith and keep pushing. Don't get weary. I'm not weary. I'm not prepared to give up. I'm prepared to go on and see what the end is going to be. I was beaten again in Selma, Alabama on March 7, 1965, during Bloody Sunday. I thought I saw death. I thought I was going to die. But Dr. King, I remember what he said on one occasion. It is better to die a physical death than to die a spiritual death. If you believe in something that is so dear and so right and so necessary, stand up for it, fight for it. Have courage. We can do it. We must do it.
So, one of the people who has carried on, and I'm going to have people wave when I introduce them, the legacy, the turn, the bending towards justice, and has carried on her father's legacy is Reverend Dr. Bernice King. She's the CEO of the King Center, which is founded by her mother, Coretta Scott King. And from this position, the same one held by her mother, Dr. King continues to advance her parents' legacy. Through her work at the center, she educates youth and adults around the world about nonviolent principles modeled by her parents. Thank you, Reverend Dr. King, for being here with us today. Thank you. Second person is a dear friend of mine who is going to make lots of history and good trouble in the House of Representatives. Yes, he's going to have to be elected on November 3rd, but given the way in which he won his primary, door to door, knocking on doors, talking to, I think, virtually everyone in CD 16 in New York, you're going to see a lot more of Jamaal Bowman, excuse me. He's the Democratic nominee for, and you know, I would say the betting is good that he's going to be the member of Congress from New York's 16th District, representing parts of Westchester and the Bronx. Dr. Bowman has been an educator and an advocate for public schools for over 20 years. He most recently served as the principal of CASA, a public middle school he founded in the Bronx, and I have had the honor to know him and be a thought partner with him for many years, and I've had the honor, great honor, to be walking the halls of his school with him. Jamaal, just wave. Leslie E. Redmond is a civil rights advocate, and at the age of 25, she became the youngest president of the Minneapolis NAACP. Leslie stood on the front lines after the unjust killing of Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, Justin Damon. She's also the founder of the Don't Complain, Activate campaign. And Leslie is joining us. You just see her picture. Leslie is joining us by audio, not by video. Thank you so much, Leslie, for being with us. And then we have a teacher in New York City, Sari Beth Rosenberg. She and I are Twitter friends, and we direct message many times a week. She's been teaching at the High School for Environmental Studies in New York City. It's a public school there, and she's been teaching there for 18 years. And she's published a lot of articles about racism and has produced a social studies curriculum for the New York City Department of Education as well. But the reason that Sari is here is that during her distance learning classes, as we all kind of converted in a nanosecond at the middle of COVID, in the middle of March, to distance learning, she changed her history lessons to incorporate more civil rights, Black Lives Matter curriculum and content, and she did it as things were happening, in light of the George Floyd murder, in light of the protests, and she also shared them with all of us, and you can see some of her lessons on sharemylesson.com site, which, by the way, we have just hit 1.7 million registered users, but also on PBS. And it's the kind of thing that teachers do in terms of taking materials and making sure we make them real and plain immediately. And I wanted to thank Sari for that work, because it's the work that we need to keep on doing over and over again. So obviously, I would want to start this panel with a question to Reverend Dr. King. And so as we reflect, and, and I suspect that every time one of our giants die, your mom, John Lewis, C.T. Vivian, that all of this must beget lots of emotions for you. And there's huge responsibility that you take up, in some ways, as the living seed of a future, because of who you are and what you have decided to take on yourself in taking on the King Center and taking on your father and your mom's legacy. So what's your vision? Give us some learning, your vision, next steps that we at the AFT should actually do to help actualize your father's dreams.
Well, thank you very much, Randy and the AFT for having me today. One of the things that I think is very important, since we're talking about teachers and educators, is that we've got to find a way to create new curriculum. And I'm glad that Sarah is doing a lot of writing in that area to introduce into our school systems. Part of the problem is that we have left out some critical parts of who we are as America. A lot of who we are as Blacks in America, in terms of our contributions to this nation, things that we have built, things that we have invented, the true stories of, the Black Wall Street, all of that kind of stuff is missing out of our history. And if we can raise up new generations of people who understand and value the contributions of all citizens of America, I think it's one of the ways we can begin to do away with systemic racism. It's kind of hard. It's difficult to correct our system, but I think we can restart some things from an educational foundation so that as people think in the future about policy, as people engage in their area of social change, as people create policies and practices in corporations, these will be the generations of young people who now understand the true essence of inclusion and ensuring that everybody feels like they belong in whatever arena of American life. So that's one of the most basic and fundamental things that I think that can happen from the education community.
I'm going to ask Sari and Jamaal, to jump in here as well in terms of how do we take that? Like, what's the next steps that we do to make it real and meaningful, and what can we as the AFT do to help do that? Jamaal, you first, and then Sari.
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me, and I'm glad we started with school curriculum. I mean, this is essential. K to 12, anti-racist, anti-hate curriculum has to be implemented in every school in this country. As a Black man in America, I did not learn about my history in public schools. I had to go outside of public schools to learn about my history, to learn about my culture. And in doing so, I was able to increase my self-esteem and self-worth within this country. One of the endearing or continuing legacies of racism is this idea that to be white makes you superior and to be Black makes you inferior. But when you learn about your history and your culture, you realize that that's not the case. And then you could begin to live on an equal playing field with those who are white or those who represent other cultures and those who represent other differences. And it's very important also to not just talk about the African-American experience in this country and our contributions in this country. It's very important for us to connect to the African diaspora and the Black diaspora throughout the world, because it's quite different to learn that your history started as slavery, right? There are many kids who believe that they entered the human experience as slaves, when in reality is we have a rich and long history back on the African continent, and where, you know, someone of Irish descent or Italian descent can connect directly to a nation and learn more about their past and their history and culture and everything that comes with that. I still do not know which country in Africa my family originated from. So that's a big part of the conversation as well. And in terms of federal policy, since I'm going to be entering Congress, you know, we need to incentivize states and school districts to implement Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and multicultural curriculum. And when I say anti-hate curriculum, I'm talking about curriculum that deals with anti-Semitism. And if we implement that K to 12 and we incentivize the implementation of that, we can see transformative change for generations to come. So I'm really excited that we started the conversation there. Thank you so much, Dr. King.
Great. Thank you, Jamaal. Sari.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's an honor to be on this panel with all of you and to see you in real life, sort of, Randy. So
there will be a moment that we will see each other in real life.
I'm holding on to hope here for that. So education, hands down, is the most valuable tool to dismantle racism, right? I'm preaching to the choir here. I'm lucky to teach 18 years proud New York City public school teacher, and New York State made a commitment to adopting culturally responsive, sustainable education model into the curriculum, not just history curriculum, in all curriculum. And I don't know what's happening across the country, but that's just a starting point, right? And I agree. We have to not just focus on an American history course. It needs to be across the board. And we need to talk about decolonizing curriculum across the board. And it's going to look different ways in different classes. And you asked what the AFT can do. Well, it starts with who's in the classroom with the students every day. It's the educators. It's having them, I think everyone is well-intentioned. It's having teachers start with their students, educating teachers about the importance of learning about each individual student's backgrounds, their hopes, their dreams. And a mantra that I always have, that I start with when helping design curriculum in New York City and in my own classes and with other teachers at my school, is I always think of this phrase: if you can't see it, you can't dream it, right? And if I'm teaching a group of students that they don't see themselves in, I teach American history, right? But if they don't see themselves at all in the American story, except for, as Jamaal was saying, as the victims, as slaves, right? Or I only use the phrase enslaved people. If that's all they see in the narrative, which is not the full story, then how did they find their path to greatness, which I think they all deserve? So that's how we create an equitable society, I believe.
Thank you. And I want to, as you all know me, we are just putting out all these, instead of using the Innovation Fund for some big projects this year, that's our fund where we put out about $1 million worth of grants to our locals to try to do this kind of path-breaking work. We're doing this in terms of giving people grants of $20,000, $50,000, $100,000 right now to work in a changed environment. And so off of this conversation, I'm saying to our delegates, and we will put this out as well, if people want to try to do this work to try to create curriculum on for younger kids, because I think from what Dr. King was saying, from Reverend Dr. King was saying, we really have to actually start with younger kids. We have to actually disrupt the stereotypes and really create inclusion, particularly if kids don't have an inclusive environment at that moment. And so maybe, Reverend Dr. King, you'll work with us on this, and the King Center will work with us on this, and let's make one of the things that we do as a union, how we develop some of this curriculum, our members doing it, and then we put it up on Share My Lesson. We work with the King Center in terms of doing it on, particularly for younger kids. Sorry, we're going to use your curriculum for older kids and others, but to actually use it for younger kids.
Yes.
Fabulous.
Indeed.
And Jamaal, since we are on, I'm going to go to Jamaal, and then I'm going to go to Leslie for a second. But since we are dwelling on Congress, and you will be there January 1st, 2021, God willing. So just tell us a little bit about how you're preparing for that. Like, what are you thinking about? How are you preparing for this? And what do you think? What's your list of must-haves in terms of what you're going to do in Congress?
So that's a great question. How am I preparing? So I'm texting you every other day to get some information and feedback around how all of this works in Washington and how to best engage with my new colleagues. I mean, I'm thankful that so many members of the Hill, members of Congress have already reached out to congratulate me and to give me counsel and offer their mentorship just to prepare me for when I get there. So I'm already engaging in conversations with my future colleagues. We're looking, and I've been looking from the very beginning of our campaign, at structural racism and institutional racism and everywhere it exists within our country. Right now there are protests across this country against police brutality. That's one place it exists, institutional racism. It also exists in mass incarceration. As we know, if you're Black or Latinx, you're more likely to be incarcerated and you're more likely to do longer sentences. It exists within our education system, not just in terms of curriculum, but in terms of hiring practices. So while we have been talking about curriculum, we should also talk about teacher recruitment and training practices. That's key, because if teachers are trained in culturally responsive education, when they enter the classroom, they're more ready, willing, and able to hit the ground running. It also exists, structural racism also exists when we look at wealth inequality and economic inequality. And this is historical. After the 13th Amendment, 1865, African Americans were promised 40 acres and a mule. We never got that 40 acres. Instead, the Homestead Act was passed and millions of acres of land was given out to whites, native-born and foreign-born, and they were able to build tremendous wealth with that land and with housing infrastructure, et cetera. African Americans were also kept out of the GI Bill, after World War II. So there's also been policies not related to education, but racist policies that have contributed to redlining, contributed to concentrated poverty, and contributed to schools being funded by local property taxes more so than state and federal government. So we're looking at structural racism in all its forms, from housing to jobs to education. That's our North Star. And I want to be a part of a Congress that creates a post-racial anti-hate society over the next few years, because the time is urgent now to get it done, and the country is demanding it. COVID has revealed what we all already knew about the inequalities, and I'm just fortunate and blessed to be a part of the conversation at this moment.
Thank you, Jamaal, and we look forward to you being there. Jamaal raises, and I'm going to go to Leslie in a second, Jamaal raises a really good point that is, we often talk about de jure discrimination that happened in the South. De facto discrimination that happened all over is as injurious in terms of what the effects have been over and over again, whether it's in underfunded schools, whether it's in our health systems, whether it's in housing, whether it's in transportation, and whether it's in wealth. We see it in terms of retirement income and retirement security. When we look at what whites generally have for retirement security and what African Americans and Hispanics have and Latinos have for retirement security. So you see racism and structural racism show up everywhere, and it's not, you can change it by, changing one police officer. You have to get to the issues of structural racism. So thank you for raising that, Jamaal. And that gets me to Leslie. You've had quite a few months right now, Leslie, that you've been dealing with as the president of the Minneapolis NAACP. And, and so I just, and I remember, we were in Minneapolis about a month after Mr. Castile was murdered. And, all the conversations and all the demonstrations at that point. But just tell us, give us some teaching, give us some preaching right now in terms of what's happening now 2 months after the murder of George Floyd. Help us understand what you're trying to do in Minneapolis. And again, some teaching to us, like we asked Dr. King, Reverend Dr. King, about what we can do in the future.
Definitely. So, grace and peace, everyone. First, I just want to say thank you to the AFT family for having me. President Randy, actually, you and I were together at the NEA convention last year, and Merwin Scott introduced us and sent us a picture. So it's great to see how it's come full circle, unfortunately, under these circumstances. But I think that we can find some good in this. For me, this is a very humbling opportunity. I just want to say, as an inner city public school student, a graduate now and a first-generation college graduate, and someone went on to get my JD MBA, but as someone who's the descendants of enslaved Africans and grandparents that migrated from North Carolina, South Carolina, Houston, Texas with 6th and 8th grade education, to be able to speak with you all right now is very humbling, especially during these troubling times. And so I just wanted to start with that. And also giving respect to our now ancestor, Representative John Lewis, who is no longer here with us, and Reverend Dr. Bernice King. When I saw that I could potentially be on a panel with them, I was definitely humbled, and I still am. So as you mentioned, President Randy, this is nothing new. Unfortunately, I've had to be on the front lines with Jamar Clark, Philando Castile, Justine Damon, and now I had to add Brother George Floyd to the list, and I actually came back from Kentucky not too long ago, standing on the front lines with Breonna Taylor. I was actually one of the 87 people who were arrested for standing and demanding justice for the life of Breonna Taylor. I think what this is doing is bringing everything to the surface. It's acknowledging that white supremacy can no longer just allow to run rampant in our communities with no accountabilities. I think that we can all take lessons from people like Chief Arredondo, who is the first African-American police chief in Minneapolis, who actually held all 4 of those officers accountable within 24 hours of the videotape being released. For those 4 officers to be fired, that was unprecedented. That was the type of courageous behavior and action that we need to be seeing. For the governor to take a courageous action and actually take the case away from the Hennepin County attorney, Mike Freeman, who doesn't prosecute officers unless there's a white woman victim, and give it to our first African-American Attorney General, Keith Ellison, was tremendous. And then for him to charge those officers and hold not only Officer Chauvin, who actually had his knee on the neck of George Floyd, but to hold all of the officers who were present on the scene and who were actually complicit in allowing the situation to happen accountable. And afterwards, Chief Arredondo actually asked me to come in and administer the new oath. And the oath for the Minneapolis Police Department hasn't been changed in decades. But Chief Arredondo again took another courageous step, and he changed the oath. And the oath talks about how, one, we have a duty to serve all human beings. We have a duty, specifically talking about police officers, to protest both verbally and physically when we see that someone's rights are being violated. And I think some of those same steps can be taken when we're thinking about teachers and principals and people who have influence over these systems. But too often we talked about education as being the great equalizer. But if that's true, it's also been the great divider. And long before young people start getting involved and engaging with police officers, we're engaging with teachers. And I can say from being in the inner city and public schools, teachers really have been either my greatest asset or the greatest liability to my future. And so what I would urge teachers and people of impact on policy is to take courageous steps to, one, listen to Black people, listen to Black leaders, listen to Black women, because too often we think that we know what's best for the Black community versus allowing the Black community to actually show you that, one, we've experienced racism and white supremacy for over 400 years, and we know exactly what it looks like and exactly how to deal with it. And that's what we're seeing in Minneapolis, and that's why we've seen some progress, is because, one, now you have not only Black faces, because I don't believe that all skin folk are your kinfolk. And so it's not just about having Black faces, but having conscious Black people in power who are actually wielding that power towards goodness and justice. That is exactly what we need to see. And I think that if given the opportunity, we can rise to the occasion. And I want to thank you, President Randy, because I do think it's important that you started off the conversation, because what you are displaying is how you can utilize your privilege and power and lend your platforms to Black conscious people and people who mean good intentions for Black people, and it's super necessary. And I'll just end with saying, don't complain, activate. That's my campaign. And the idea is that you don't have to be President Barack Obama or Beyonce Knowles Carter in order to activate your community. You could be a mom or a dad. You could be a teacher. You could be an activist and attorney as myself. We can all activate. We all should activate. And I believe we can activate through 3 C's of activation: communication, collaboration, and compassion. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. And I, again, just like we said about the curriculum work, what we want to do is during this convention, this virtual convention, we scroll a lot of things before each session. So we're going to scroll some of the things that you have on Don't Complain, Activate campaign. And this is what I want you to do, Leslie, to help us. We have something called Our Voices, where members and others write things for our website, and we distribute them far and wide. And I want us to be really involved, if you want us to, in the Don't Complain, Activate campaign. It's kind of like don't complain, organize,
100%.
Exactly.
Yes, I love that.
Fabulous. And then, because, we have to always take what we say to action. Words mean a lot, but action means more. It reinforces the words. And so I want to just put Sari on the hook for a second before I go back to Reverend Dr. King. All of us, like we had the AFT, we've done the Racial Equity Task Force and Committee that Dr. Loretta Johnson started. We released, I am told that we were the first union to release our report. We will continue with that work. You saw yesterday we passed a resolution in June. We have 19 commitments, covenants that we are doing, including diversity to try to diversify our teaching force. But just like me, Sarah, you and I are both white. So how are you thinking about how you have these conversations with white colleagues? How are you doing it? How are we taking the lessons that Leslie just said to us?
You know, I'm glad you asked me that. And first off, remind them of their privilege, because I think that, yes, everyone has been, especially, immediately after the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the list goes on and on. I'd fill up my space if I listed all those murders. As that became something that people were being forced to pay attention to on their Instagram feed, our role is to not make that go away and actually have those public conversations with our colleagues and discuss white privilege. I had a conversation with a guest in my class one day, Dr. Uhuru Williams, and I shared my story of how I experienced white privilege with Dr. Williams and my students who are primarily Black and brown, not white. And just sharing that story with your colleagues and making your white colleagues see it, because even though I think that everyone has the best intentions, especially if you get into education, and especially if you're working with, as we like to say, diverse populations, but people who are not white, students who are not white. I think we all have the best intentions, but I think we just need to just have more brave, honest conversations about it with each other, so that when the educators go back into the classroom, they're aware of it. And they come into class in an authentic way to then listen and raise the voices of their students. So I think in a nutshell, it's being brave, speaking out, perhaps dealing with pushback from your colleagues, because I found that sometimes the first step when you bring up these really, which shouldn't be in 2020, but they are difficult conversations around racism, sometimes people don't respond great. They push back, they act out. Be ready for it, but have faith that you're doing it for a greater good, and it'll click. I like to believe it clicks. And it might not click with everyone, but you have to be brave and take those risks with your white colleagues, because just keep thinking of your students and how, like, I love what Leslie said about the education is always called the great equalizer, but it can be the great divider as well. And I can completely see that, right? Because especially as a white educator, if you're not aware of your privilege, and then if you're not aware of the fact that sometimes the best way to learn, the best way to teach is to silence yourself and listen to what your students are saying. If you don't realize that, then you can't make education be the great equalizer, right? So that's my advice. Be brave and be willing to deal with the pushback and the uncomfortableness of it.
I see Reverend Dr. King shaking her head a lot as you were speaking. Do you think that makes sense, Reverend Dr. King?
Yeah, it makes a whole lot of sense. One of the things that my father wrote in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos and Community, in the World House chapter, is that we must learn, to live together as brothers and sisters, or together we'll be forced to perish as fools. And that learning does require a lot of listening. It requires understanding that there are things you just do not know. It's giving up your right to be right, so that you can deeply engage the other person. I think that if we're going to make any progress in this nation now on the racial front, it is going to take the white community really stepping up to the plate now. For the last eons of years, Black people have been fighting this fight and doing it alone. And I would say for the most part with dignity. And the only way that we're going to see substantial change is when the white community really has these serious, in-depth, honest, transparent, forthright, courageous, brave, every word that you can think of, tough and uncomfortable. That's a word that needs to be put out there. It is going to be uncomfortable because it means you're going to have to give something up. Daddy often reminded us that the first stage of the movement that they were fighting didn't cost us anything. It didn't cost anything to integrate lunch counters. It didn't cost anything to integrate most places. But now when we move toward equality, or what I would say equity, it means that there's going to be a dear cost to pay, and there's going to be sacrifice in the process. But it is necessary if we are not going to revisit over and over again the terrible things that we keep witnessing, and those of us in the Black community continue to experience. And so I agree with her 100%. And I would also say, white people who don't have experience in the Black community need to develop those experiences, not just in the safe spaces. The safe spaces are, in the restaurant. Come into some of the Black cultural experiences. Come into the Black community. Don't be afraid. I have a white friend here in Atlanta, and it's so funny because there are times when people are saying, "Aren't you afraid?" And actually, she says, "No, nobody ever bothers me." And so I just want to dispel this myth that it's dangerous in the Black community. That is not true. And you won't know that unless you insert yourself in that community and truly experience it. So that would be my challenge to all of even the white educators, because as long as we remain insulated, we're going to continue to get the same results that we have.
So we have to, sorry, you go, Jamaal.
Well, I just have to jump in.
Of course.
Reverend Dr. King is so correct. Like, there's nothing to be afraid of. Like, there's no history, documented history of white people coming into Black neighborhoods and getting beat up or anything like that. There's literally nothing to be afraid of. And what I would add very quickly, Randy, is we have to hold elected officials accountable as well. And if elected officials are not ready to adopt, introduce, and enact policy that is anti-racist and anti-hate, they need to be voted out of office. And I think the AFT, as an organizing social justice union in partnership with the NEA and in partnership with other unions who really care about social justice in a real way, have to hold elected officials accountable in the U.S. House of Representatives, in the U.S. Senate, in state houses, in county houses, in city government, in school board elections. We have to hold elected officials accountable to an anti-racist agenda. And if we're able to do that, we can really accelerate what happens with our policy across the country.
So I know, I could actually spend about a couple of hours with all of you, and I know I am running out of time. I have about 10 more minutes. So I want to make sure before we run out of time that I am sure there's a question. I mean, we just scratched the surface, but I'm sure there's things that, the last question I want to ask everybody, and I want to start with Dr. Reverend King, is I want to ask the question I asked Dr. Fauci yesterday, that people have been asking me a lot, which is what gives you hope? In a situation right now where we have these 3 crises that have been made worse by an elected official, Donald Trump, but they're all the through line between the racial reckoning, the economic recession, the COVID, is all you see the inequality. And frankly, those of us in the labor movement, we're pretty comfortable with a class analysis. But we have a hard time with understanding that's a class and a race analysis. If we're going to be really honest with each other. I know that, the UAW, AFT, others helped in the March on Washington in 1963, but it was for jobs and justice. We're comfortable with the class analysis. But what about how we do what Reverend Dr. King just said to us? So what gives you, in the last few minutes, what gives you hope in this moment?
I think there are 2 things that give me hope, other than my strong Christian faith. One, I've been in conversations and dialogue behind the scenes with people who are really trying to make some changes, particularly those of influence in places of power, even in corporate America. So that gives me hope because I don't think that has ever happened before. But it has happened because, and this is my second hope, is because there's been a generation of young voices who have dared to not let us go back to business as usual, to not let us ignore that Black Lives Matter. For the past 8 years, they have been consistent with that message about Black Lives Matter. And their fervency about it, I think, is giving me hope. And the fact that they are determined to do whatever is necessary. And I don't mean in the violent means, but do what's necessary so that we can make these substantive changes and transform America so that we can begin to eradicate racism. So it's the youth that give me hope, and it's the people in places of influence right now that give me hope that I have not seen before in terms of the two operating at the same time.
Thank you. Leslie, what gives you hope? And Leslie, someone just texted me the picture from last year.
From last year.
I love that.
Look at us. Full circle moment. So what gives me hope, and this is actually something Reverend Al Sharpton talked about at George Floyd's funeral. He talked about the fact of all the young and old white people that are standing up and activating during this season. And I can say I've personally seen that as well. When we were locked up, and that was my first time being locked up, FYI. When we were locked up in Kentucky, we had just as many of our white sisters sitting there with our Black sisters. We are constantly seeing that white people realize that no longer can they sit on the sidelines, but that this is just as much their fight as it is ours. And I have to remind people that the NAACP was founded by white and Black people, and recognizing that our brutality and our suffrage is not ours alone. And so I'm really looking forward to white people taking their rightful place in the struggle and recognizing that this is not white against Black, but this is humans against white supremacy.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you for helping to lead us. Sari, and then I'm going to end with Jamaal. What gives you hope?
So, of course, everyone on this panel, and I'm not just saying that because I'm on the panel with everyone, you give me hope each and every day in all the work that you're doing. And I'm going to say, of course, teachers give me hope. And I wasn't the only teacher who shifted gears when the people took to the streets in response to George Floyd's murder. Multiple educators, thousands of educators across the country changed their lessons around too. I just know it. So it gives me hope that teachers are willing to really want to get into these brave conversations with their students. But I'm going to say my students. The students I personally know give me so much hope. Yesterday, I can't leave them alone. I hopped on an IG Live with them. And
Wait, what did you just say you hopped into?
I hopped on an Instagram Live, just like a live. They know. They're always like, oh, you're back. Yeah. They're not even my students. They're going to be seniors next year. And I just wanted to see what they were up to. And I didn't expect this, but I kind of expected it. They're out there. I have students part of Integrate NYC. And one of my students informed me, he's the president, Noel, shout out to Noel. He's the president of the student council next year. Well, he's now the current president. He's organizing not only a Black student union at our school, he's not stopping there. He's working with students across the city of New York who are also setting up Black student unions to create an inter-union agency of sorts. So these kids, a lot of them didn't, their parents wanted to stay home and safe when the protesting was happening. They were working behind their screens as well to either educate themselves, which is a form of activism, as we know, and I tell them every day, and going above and beyond when they have so much that was so hard for them, losing their junior year, seeing their friends, having problems, there was a lot of illness in their families related to COVID and stuff, but they are all activated. and they're doing it in such creative ways and brave ways. So I know that's not just happening with my students, it's happening across the country. And we saw that before the global pandemic. And I only think it's just as troubling and as difficult as this time has been. What gives me hope is that we're all still fighting. And I think we're even more inspired right now because we see what the stakes are, and my students are leading the way. But I agree, it needs to be all of us together. I tell my students, it can't just be, I hate when people say, well, we messed up things, your generation has to fix it. No, it needs to be, yeah, you need white allies, and you also need, everyone in on the fight. And it needs to be, as we've seen in the streets, it's been I've been inspired not just by my white brothers and sisters out in the streets, in finally waking up and getting out there and putting their bodies in the line, but it's multi-generational. We all need to work together here. And I'm inspired that my students are leading the way, but I'm telling them I'm there with them. So that's what's inspiring me, just to name a few things.
The protests that I've been at have been all multi-generational and all multiracial. And to your point, and as many of you know, I live in Inwood, New York, the northernmost little town in Manhattan. And, I've seen a lot of teachers come up to me to say, that are walking and protesting as well. Jamaal, you get the last word. What gives you hope?
Everything everyone has already said gives me hope. Humans against white supremacy. Thank you, Leslie, for that. And I think that's what we're all talking about. Diverse coalitions have taken to the streets every single day since George Floyd's murder and are now working in coalition, in conjunction, across race, across class, across religion, across differences to push back against a system of oppression. That's what gives me hope more than anything. I mean, in this election here, we triple voter turnout. We triple turnout amongst young people and people of color. We had kids telling their parents they better vote for Jamaal Bowman. There were people who wanted to take pictures with me, selfies, and say, oh my God, my daughter is going to be so excited. And when I asked, how old is your daughter? The woman told me 15 years old. So that's what we're seeing. We're seeing young people, our elders, our seniors, working together in conjunction, pushing back against an oppressive system. So the diverse coalitions in our streets that are holding elected officials accountable and demanding change, that's what gives me hope.
So I want to just say one more time, again, I could be with, they're just amazing. It's so odd to be doing this virtually, but this way so many people get to see us. But Reverend Dr. King, thank you for everything you've done and will continue to do. And I want our members, please get involved with the center and please support the King Center. We need to actually support these amazing resources and jewels that we have that have been doing this kind of work for decades, for centuries. We need to support the King Center. Leslie, we also need to support, the members who are listening, we need to support Don't Complain, Activate campaign. And we need to support the work that Leslie is doing. Remember, and I didn't say this before.
Coming out, Don't Complain, Activate.
Say it again, did I say it right?
I have a book that's coming out, Don't Complain, Activate.
Fabulous.
I'll let you know, President.
And as soon as it comes out, we will make sure that it gets publicized. So thank you. And Leslie, what is the youngest president of the Minneapolis NAACP? I think, are you really 25 years old?
I'm 28 now, but I really was 25 when I took over.
Wow. And then you have, and then, Sari, and she's absolutely right, the kind of changing up lessons, really taking on issues, having hard conversations, even with the pushback. Don't be silent, engage. This is righteous work that we need to do. We can't just leave it to our amazing reverends or rabbis in the pulpit. This is righteous work we need to do every single day. And Jamaal, your kind of advocacy, Jamaal Bowman, your kind of advocacy, the work you've done at CASA and the work you're going to do in Congress is extraordinary. And we just can't wait to see you in the Congress, walking that floor, talking to your colleagues, and having yet another teacher in the Congress, but having a civil rights and justice warrior in the Congress in the footsteps and the legacy of John Lewis. So I want to thank all of these amazing people and this amazing panel. And again, I want to just remind people that we have the 19 commitments, covenants, I call them, not commitments, that we have made, including making anti-racism training part and parcel of every bit of training that the AFT does, in line with both what Reverend Dr. King said earlier, and Sari and Jamaal and Leslie said earlier. How do we make sure we embed every single day in the work that we're doing? So thank you very, very much to our panelists, and I'll see you soon, virtually or otherwise. Thank you.
Thank you.
And now, I think I'm supposed to do this, right? Great, fantastic. Okay, great. And now we're going to be joined by Evelyn DeJesus, our Executive Vice President, who, by the way, it is her birthday today, and she will send us a video greeting and share a few things that will lead to our next conversation about economics. Evie.
You see it? It's
Yeah.
moving.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
That was the moment when the school started shaking,
Scratches?
and then when he looked again, the building was going down.
Oh, his library went into the ground. It's crushed. I'm so sorry.
Thank God you were not inside.
That's it.
When we go to the refugees, most of the kids start running, yelling to us, teacher, how are you? Are you okay? Instead of saying that they are not well, they were asking about our health. I was amazed because children are scared, but also you can feel the love that is feeling in the air. You know, they need to hear us, the teachers, saying that everything is going to be fine.
Because they trust you.
Yes,
and they know you and they love you.
I can tell you that they are also our strength to continue.
Amen.
Because we know that they need us. We are going to rise again. And believe me, we're really grateful. We're really grateful. Juanica, the teachers, our kids, we're grateful. Thanks a lot for being here.
We did it in Vieques. We did it in Ponce, Guayanilla. We did it in Yauco and Peñuelas. You know,
So these are the 5 areas.
yes, the 5 municipalities that were most affected.
If we could get the schools open, then you could do psychological services for kids and for staff.
Claro.
I know today we brought supplies,
Right.
but it's not just a water filter or a book or Similac, as important as it is, but
Sustainability.
how's the infrastructure, the houses.
Exactly.
So she just built a house. She's only been there 6 months. And now she just got in and this is what happened. And they were sleeping inside. They had to go through the back. Thank God they had a staircase. They could exit out. All her life savings are in this house. Good morning, everyone. We're here in Juanica, Puerto Rico with the American Federation of Teachers and the Asociación de Maestras. This is Maria, a teacher just like you and I, a member, a sister. And this is the after effects. She saved all her life this beautiful home. She's been living here several months. And this was what has happened to her. And she's living outside in the tent city areas. So we're asking that you give funds so can help Maria reconstruct her life, her home, her soul, her psyche, everything that comes.
Era una casa de 6 meses nada más de construida, con todos los ahorros. Solamente pude vivir 6 meses ahí. Es una casa de 4 personas. Mi hijo está en el ejército y fue ayer enviado a Kuwait a servir al ejército de los Estados Unidos. Es terrible. Estoy viviendo en la calle. No tengo dónde quedarme. Una experiencia bien fuerte.
Esta es una de nuestras maestras de Guánica que con gran esfuerzo tuvo su hogar y ahora lo pierde en unos segundos. Así que todo el que pueda ayudar a que esta maestra pueda tener nuevamente su hogar como ella merece y no deje de estar viviendo en las casetas donde está viviendo, se lo vamos a agradecer. Exhortamos a la ayuda para que ella y su familia, sus niños, puedan tener un hogar seguro. Así que Dios les bendiga a todas las personas que quieran ayudar a esta maestra de Guánica.
We are here with our affiliate, the AFT and ANPR, in the areas that were most hit to assess the need, talk to our members, talk to children, and figure out what should be done, because it hasn't been done by anyone, not FEMA, not the Puerto Rican government, not the American government. That is why your union is here. And so we have the AFT Disaster Fund. We will also be raising money for Maria and people like Maria who have lost everything. But we are going to make sure that this teacher and her family and so many other families feel safe. And God bless you, and God bless your son.
There he is. So we wanted to introduce this next panel with one of the writers in this country, actually in the world, that I am enamored with. Not that I can say his name very often correctly, and he's going to help us all say his name correctly, but Anand has really thought about the issues of inequity and what has happened in not only the United States, but the world. The New Deal was a promise that we would change things, that there would be more equity, that there would be more opportunity. But when you see that video from Puerto Rico, a territory of the United States who hasn't gotten to make a decision, even though it should, about whether it wants to be a state or whether it wants independence. And you see what has happened over and over again, particularly in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, how the United States has operated and has basically taken more than given to Puerto Rico, whereas we often remind the United States government, these are American citizens. Whether it's Puerto Rico or so many other places in the country, you see the kind of inequity that operates, not the racial inequity that we just talked about in the last program, and the economic, the class inequity. And frankly, and Anand knows this, when I read through Winners Take All, we reached out, and this was months and months and months ago, to say, would you actually help us understand and help our members and our delegates understand this deep inequity and this deep inequality, and what do we do about it? And maybe how do we use this moment, and I know the word reimagine has been overused, but how do we use this moment to take the kind of bold action that was taken in the New Deal, that was taken in the Great Society, and what do we need, in addition to an election, to try to actually make that happen? And so you have probably seen Anand he's an editor-at-large for Time. He's been on MSNBC a lot. Mika and Joe on Morning Joe actually let him finish his sentences. He is a visiting scholar at the Arthur L. Carter Journalism Institute at NYU. He's a former columnist and correspondent for the New York Times, and I've already talked a lot about Winners Take All, the book about, the title is actually Winners Take All, the elite charade of changing the world. And in that book, he investigates the global elite's efforts to change the world, essentially by preserving their power in the world while they actually try to undermine everybody else. We've seen this in schooling all the time when the so-called reform movements actually called us the status quo crowd when they in fact were the status quo crowd, and they didn't give us the resources or the wherewithal to do what we want and need to do. They often, these billionaires and millionaires, portray themselves as saviors for the poor and sideline the institutions that are actually trying to enable opportunity. As I said, we saw that pretty clearly, and you see that every single day with somebody by the name of Betsy DeVos. We, as educators, as Anand knows, have experienced firsthand, and frankly, our nurses as well, and frankly, our public employees as well, the firsthand, the corporatization of public education, the gimmicks, the quick fixes, the high-stakes testing, the penalizing schools instead of fixing them, closing them, the competition with charters, and frankly, when a lot more of listening to educators and giving us the resources so we can meet the needs for students would be a lot more efficacious. And so he knows, like we do, that something's deeply wrong in the economy when even before COVID, you had 78% of Americans living paycheck to paycheck. And the stat, I'm sure everyone has heard me say every time I speak, 40% of Americans pre-COVID couldn't cover a $400 emergency. And since then, we've seen what we've seen. I'm not going to repeat my speech, but it is shocking that with all the economic despair that in the last few months, billionaires added $584 billion to their own wealth. So help us, Anand, figure out all of this. Talk to us about what we should be doing. First off, kind of the analysis you did in Winners Take All, but how should we be thinking about this oligarchy that is threatening America and this, not only the services we provide, but just even before we talk about Donald Trump, just the whole oligarchical structure that we seem to have and we need to combat. And thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Randy. And I'm such an admirer of your moral passion. I've also never been interviewed by someone in such a good jacket before. I want to say, just before I even get into that, just a shout out to all your teachers and nurses and others, because this is obviously a time of tremendous anxiety, not just for everybody, but for them in particular, given the work they do, given the uncertainty about the fall. And I think as I was listening to you, it strikes me that at this moment, your membership has a really historic opportunity. They have borne a historic burden in what I call the age of capital, the age of money, the age of greed we've been living in. Teachers have borne the brunt of the billionairization of America. Every time some new billionaire starts a social network because they're too socially awkward to meet girls in person and makes all this money and then decides they want to fix public education, who is it that has to implement their harebrained schemes? Who is it that has to, use their tablets suddenly and then change which software they use next year because there's a new patron in town? So it's teachers who have lived this billionairization, this feudalization of America. And it's teachers who know very well that right now, in an increasingly oligarchic America, you are pouring your heart and soul into students, equipping them for the battles of life ahead. And you know deep down that you are sending them into a society designed to crush their dreams. You just have them as a teacher for that period of time, right? you are sending them into a world where social mobility in this country has ground to a virtual halt. We think the American dream is something that, you can out-earn your parents, make a better life than your parents. Actually, we are the least American dreamy country among all the rich countries. And so I believe, and we should get into this in any way you want, that it is actually time for a movement of America's teachers and associated workers to rise up, not just against Donald Trump. That's an easy target, an important target. Fascism, always go for that first. Not just against the Republican Party either. Obvious target again, important work. But frankly, against the oligarchy we are becoming. And that gets us into a more difficult conversation about the Democratic Party as well. And the ways in which the Democratic Party, that in many ways is an ally to your cause, certainly more than the other side, has been grossly complicit in enabling the capital kind of takeover of America. We've talked about racial supremacy, white supremacy in the previous hour. There's also capital supremacy in America, and it works very well with white supremacy. And we should have a conversation, because only teachers have the leverage, perhaps, in our political system to force more than just one side winning or another, to force there to be better Democrats, not just more Democrats, as Cynthia Nixon says, but to really force a shift so that there is at least one party in America that is an anti-oligarchy party. Right now in America, there is not.
Do you think we should define the word oligarchy for people? I think we, you and I have used words like oligarchy, fascism. And so when you say oligarchy, what do you mean by it?
I mean a society that is run by, for, and of the interests of a very small number of concentrated, wealthy people. And if you want to look at the symptoms of an oligarchy, ask yourself, when there are policy choices in Washington, and there's something that is good for money and there's something that's good for most people, which generally gets done? I think the answer would be the thing that's good for a few rich people. When we have new technologies that begin, as all the tech did some years ago, with these promises of flattening hierarchies and leveling playing fields, who captures most of the gains of that stuff? Most people, or a handful of those at the top? Again, is the best way to get ahead to work hard or to be born ahead? You get your answer there. And so, on issue after issue in American life, and public education is a flamboyant example of this, we now increasingly live in a society that is defined by the following double picture. Picture one is, first, we tell rich and powerful people that the best lived life, we actually tell everybody this, just some people are able to achieve it, that the best lived life is a life spent making money in whatever way possible, cutting whatever societal corner you can. So if you can avoid taxes, do that. If you can evade taxes, do that. If you can use fancy real estate investment trusts in the Cayman Islands, not for vacation, but for hiding money, do that. If you can lobby in Washington for bottle service public policy that is good for you and your friends in the back of the club, but bad for everybody else, do that. If you can buy politicians, do that. If you can use philanthropy to, on the second half of things, after you've made your money, to launder your reputation, extend your influence into places like public school where your thoughts, frankly, have no place that they belong, then what you do is you use this do-gooding, this philanthropy, this changing the world, all the stuff that all of your members have heard day in and day out from the oligarchs. You use it, even though it is part of making things worse, to justify the system that allows you to keep taking. And so, to put it in the educational context for a second, we are seeing right in front of us, if you want to understand oligarchy as a life cycle, there are teachers listening to this right now who are teaching students whose parents were foreclosed on in the 2008 financial crisis and lost their home and became unhoused, who themselves as students are now being jerked around by some billionaire's ideas, some Wall Street financier that has adopted some school in New York, and that kid is now having to jump through the hoops and the teachers having to jump through hoops because that billionaire who put their parents out in the street is donating to the school. And then in a few years, that child is going to be an adult in the labor force. And that same Wall Street person that helped make the parents be homeless some years ago, that helped jerk around the child's education through helping, is a few years from now going to be blocking the unionization efforts and avoiding pay increases for that child when that child becomes a grown-up. And so I think it is great to talk about the importance of defeating Trump and the importance of this election. I think it's incredibly important, even more important, to talk about how do we fundamentally transform the power equations of this country, and to speak truth about the fact that Joe Biden, Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, some of them coming up I know, have not shown, as I read it, any significant commitment to leading an anti-oligarchy party. They're better than the alternative, but they are a million miles from good enough. And I think it's incredibly important work in terms of your members' voice to think about how we fight for a better Democratic Party.
One of the things, for our members that are listening, they all know how close I am to both the Speaker and to the Minority Leader of the Senate. But I think what Anand is saying is really, really important. And one of the things we've learned is that elections are not enough. Like I think in 2008, people actually said, okay, Obama is amazing, and just, he got elected, and then let him do it. I think what we learned very much, particularly in light of having Arnie Duncan and then Michelle Rhee and Joel Klein and others, all of whom said they were Democrats. What we learned is you have to have activism and elections. And it's the activism both before and after. Before, it's obvious in terms of get out the vote and things like that. But you have to have a real changing of the narrative in terms of what is and what isn't important. And if wealth is more important than work, and if corporations are more important than working families, and that is the dominant narrative in a country, then you're not going to actually have the people with you. You'll have the people who are angry, but you're not going to have the people who are with you who understand that that's there. And,
yes.
And I think that's part of what we've learned in terms of changing the narrative on education, because the Betsy DeVos types and the Koch brother types, they'll always fight unionization. We need to actually have someone in elective office who will give us the legal rights to unionize more and more, to be the power balance. But we also need other types of things like, will we ever be able to get campaign finance again? Will we get that kind of level of money out of the elections? Can we have, excuse me, the rewriting of the economic rules, as Elizabeth Warren has said? So I guess what I'm asking you is, give us a little bit about what you think that agenda should be, assuming we can get Joe Biden elected. What's the next steps in terms of that agenda? We don't stop there, as you just said. What's the next steps?
So if you had to define the biggest false ideology undergirding the establishment Democratic Party, it is the consensus that I try to take on in the book, which is this notion of the win-win, right? There's no question the Democrats are meaningfully different than Republicans, but they are all part of this win-win consensus. And what the win-win consensus says, in a nutshell, is the people up above in the stratosphere are not up there because of the people down there, and the people down there are not down there because of the people up there. These are two independent facts, and what we need to do to the people down there is help them get up there also. Build more ladders to the stratosphere. And the problem with the win-win myth is that it ignores the fact that the people are up there because they're standing on the necks of the people down below them. And they do so in several ways. They do so through, as I said, manipulating the tax code, lobbying for public policy, opposing healthcare for most people, letting a world in which people can be evicted in a pandemic, be a world that happens. And The question then becomes, what would a Democratic Party that actually had the courage of shattering the win-win myth look like? Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren took on that myth. They didn't win. But when I look at someone like Chuck Schumer, for example, and maybe he can respond to this if he's coming on later. I see someone who is very much a senator from Wall Street. I don't think there's any serious person who would look at Chuck Schumer and say that he's not a senator from Wall Street. Now, I think if
I may disagree with you, but that's because I know him well for generations. But I totally understand your perspective.
Are spilling blood, sweat, and tears to educate students into an economy that someone like Chuck Schumer, by supporting Wall Street to the extent he has, even if he's right on education issues, if you think that, by supporting Wall Street in the way that Chuck Schumer has made a career doing, he is ensuring that the people you are educating are going into an economy that will mock and humiliate and underpay them 90% of the time. It is private equity that has driven that. Yep. It is hedge funds that have driven that. It is these massive funds that have driven that. And the question I have is, what's the point of being a Democrat if you're going to be a Democrat from Wall Street? The thing I admire about Republicans, and this is not normally how I begin a sentence, the thing I admire about them is the intellectual coherence. Republicans believe that government is bad. Ragging on government is good for their financial interests, and it's what they go do. Democrats often have an egalitarian ideal, talk about all these issues of equity, right? Then a lot of establishment Democrats raise money from, frankly, the same plutocratic class that is funding the Republicans, and then operate in this very mixed way where it's sort of, I want free college for everybody, but actually not really, and I want healthcare for everybody, but no, and I want to protect people from eviction, but only so they have the right to a lawyer if they're getting evicted, not just not getting evicted. And so you end up with this milquetoast Democratic Party that is neither here nor there.
So what happens if we win the Senate, the House of Representatives, and the presidency? In some ways, that would then require, when I say win, because we are pushing to make sure that Mitch McConnell is not the majority leader of the Senate, and not just for the small, as important as it is, the Supreme Court is hugely important. A Democratic Senate, a Democratic president would be different. But let's actually push this. What happens if we can win? What are the things that we need to do almost immediately to try to create that kind of balance of power? And my theory here is nobody's going to do it because you've asked them. You have to actually create the advocacy base, and you have to create the activism to actually push those strategies. So what's what's that?
I'll give you the two answers, the laundry list and the how, because I think there's an important. I think the laundry list is not going to be unfamiliar to people, but I think it's going to be really important if your membership is able to start marching in lockstep around some of these things, right? We need to talk about a taxation revolution in this country. That is a wealth tax, right? Frankly, I would argue both Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren's wealth taxes were inadequate to the plutocracy that we are becoming. Both of them would have allowed billionaires to continue getting wealthier than the rest of us and than they are now, just at a slightly diminished rate, even Bernie's. And we need to talk about an erosive wealth tax that would actually make these big fortunes that are incompatible with the existence of democracy. Let's say that again. Jeff Bezos' absolute level of wealth is inconsistent with a healthy democracy. Just someone sitting in their house with that much money makes a democracy unstable. We can't have fortunes that large. I would love to see your membership get excited around those issues of wealth taxation, capital gains taxation, extreme income taxation, so on and so forth. Second, I know this is a delicate issue for a lot of unions, but it is time, I think, to really talk about Medicare for all and not talk about it simply in terms of one's own interests, but in terms of what it means to actually achieve a country in which we could liberate 350 million people from ever having to think about that issue ever again. Because I would much rather, in a country of this much promise and ingenuity, I would much rather have people thinking about the lesson plan they want to teach tomorrow, the business they want to go start, the space vessel that they want to invent. Right now, we have too many people sitting at kitchen tables looking at medical bills. Most people in rich countries do not spend any of their time sitting at kitchen tables reading medical bills. But that's an enormous part of the expenditure of the person hours of the United States every year. Third, I think we have to talk about—
How do we stop the insurance companies, Big Pharma and others, who have tried to kill every attempt to do healthcare as a right?
Well, you got every teacher in the streets, along with people in other professions. There's not that many pharma executives. But there hasn't been consensus on this, as you know. And I think it's really important.
Yeah, I mean, even within our own union.
Who have insurance and the sake of people who don't. Even if you have good insurance, you are living in a barbaric country right now. You are living in a country that, and I'll say one more thing and then let's talk about the how, but I think we have to also talk about the same thing on education, right? Something I talk about in the book, I went to an event and quoted this guy from the platform cooperativism movement. And he said, in every era of history, there are some shared assets that people have no choice but to use, right? In the Middle Ages, it might have been a granary or something, like that there was just some town granary, and if one guy owned that and most people couldn't use it, people would die. Well, in the 21st century, education is that granary, right? It is not a choice to go to college if the economics work the way they do. You can't punish people economically for not going to college and then make it so elusive to go. Anything that is required of people, that your society requires of people to live a halfway dignified life, should be free. And not overcomplicating it the way Democrats do with this grant and this means test. Just make public college free. That would be another powerful issue to get behind. Now, I think we have to talk about the how, and this is where I think teachers understand this very well, because you're communicating with all kinds of students who come at these issues from all kinds of angles, all kinds of backgrounds, don't all think the same thing. And so teachers understand you got to meet people where they are.
Exactly.
Use different language. The message that gets Johnny and the message that gets Sadia may be different messages, so on and so forth. And the Democratic Party—
Which is why we have to reduce class size, which is why we have to have well-being resources.
Correct. But the Democratic Party, in my view, is horrible at language.
Yeah.
If you take all the issues that I just went through, I didn't bother to dress them up in language. I just told you the issues, right? And the way I said them, I'm sure they sounded very progressive to people. I'm sure they sounded too left to some people. That's fine. That may be the actual core issue as presented that way. But as the Republicans have been practicing for years, there are ways to talk about policies that actually explain the appeal of them, make the case for them to a way broader swath of people using language. So if it were me, I would actually not talk about healthcare as a human right with Medicare for All. I would talk about it in the language of patriotism and personal transformation, right? I would say, just as we, have fought wars around the world and don't leave people down on the battlefield dying out of a sense of solidarity and patriotism, we don't leave people down on the battlefield of ill health. We don't. We're Americans. It's patriotism. Second, I would argue on that same issue, personal transformation, right? You go to the grocery store back when, we spent a lot of time at grocery stores and browsing in the aisles and not being afraid we were going to get a virus. You have all these magazines. What are all those magazines say? They're not the good magazines. They're the magazines that are telling you, do this and change your marriage and do this and lose 10 pounds. So that tells you something about our culture. We're a culture that is very drawn to the language of you can change your life. Okay. You know what would really change your life? Healthcare. Let's talk to people in a language of—
Actually, a living wage. That would change your life. Actually having retirement security, childcare.
You know how many marriages would be saved or improved by people not stressing about retirement?
Yeah.
Not stressing about healthcare. I said this to Michael Moore on his podcast, and he was like, "Are you saying Medicare for All would make people have better sex?" And I said, well, I wasn't, that's not what I was saying, but I think that is absolutely indisputably true.
Right. Well, and you see it. So the question I have for you is, I have many questions for you. But part of why we wanted to have you on, Anand, is that you've really been thinking about all of these issues. How do we separate and like what we saw, frankly, over the course of the last 5 years, in light of the teacher strikes, where the right was not able to actually define them, that the teachers themselves, whether it was in West Virginia, in Oklahoma, in Chicago, in LA, defined what the issues were, which are repeatedly, teachers really want what children need, and we need the resources to get there. Same as, frankly, the issues in terms of reopening schools right now. What we saw in this Democratic campaign this time was that all of the candidates actually were singing from that hymnal. And that, I don't know how the other Unity Commission task forces went, but the one that I sat on education, pre-K through higher ed, there was huge consensus between the Bernie and the Bernie Sanders and the Joe Biden people, and that ended up in the platform. That platform, the Democratic platform today on education, looks completely different. Well, I shouldn't say completely, radically different than the Democratic platform 10 years ago. And what I learned from that is that the work we've done on the ground has really helped change things. Your thoughts?
You know, I think what was so powerful about those strikes from the outside is that they were local. They were locally led. They were specific to specific issues in those communities. They, unlike most things in American life today, I don't think they immediately fell into the well-defined lines of our polarized debates.
Yep.
They straddled left and right in interesting ways that are important if you want to get anything done in America. And I think I would zoom out to say they are an example of what is going to save us, which is not electing the other side in a two-party contest every 2 or 4 years, but fundamentally redistributing power in America.
Right.
And doing that by creating countervailing power, right? Because if you are an oligarch, your advantage is you have all this money, right? And another advantage you have is actually because you don't have that many people on your side, it's not that hard to coordinate them, right? Like you can get all of you in a room or a Zoom and make some plans. And that's what the Koch brothers and Richard Mellon Scaife and these other families did on the right. That's what folks like Zuckerberg and Bezos and others who may be a little bit more associated with the left do. The advantage of being a regular person is that there are hundreds of millions of you in the United States. The difficulty is organizing. The difficulty is getting on the same page on some things. And there is something about our politics now where sometimes small differences keep us divided from each other and deter us from marshaling that kind of countervailing power. But it is going to be the countervailing power of unions and associations and other kinds of civic organizations and uprisings that pushes back against the tide of oligarchy. You know, you asked folks about hope earlier, and I actually have found this to be obviously a grim time the way everybody else does, but a grim time pregnant with a kind of hope. Because this feels to me like the end of something. It just has that, you know, when you're watching a movie, you don't even know how long the movie is, but at some point in the movie, particularly if it's well made, you start to sense that things are wrapping up, the storylines are, we are living at the end of a movie. And we know what the movie is. The movie has been the age of greed. The movie has been an age in which your teachers are working their tails off to educate people and send them into a society that spends their life dissing them.
Without soap, without ventilation, without resources.
Right. The question is, what's the next movie in the queue?
Right.
And that is where we have a choice. And I would not, I say hope, but I wouldn't take it for granted that that's a good movie. That movie could be fascism, because Donald Trump is a fascist running for re-election in America. That could be, tribal nationalism. That could be, Tucker Carlson's bow tie intellectual white nationalism. But it could also be, and I hope it would be, an age of reform. You brought up the New Deal. What was the New Deal? It was it wasn't a set of policies, which it was. It was fundamentally and deeper and above and below that, a transformation of this society in the direction of the interests of ordinary people, a drastic rebalancing of power. And frankly, thinking about a union like yours, there aren't that many institutions left in America that are this big, this influential, this feverish about politics, enough to affect any kind of meaningful political change. You all have that influence, and it's up to you to decide how you want to spend it.
Well, I think on that point, I think that's a really important kind of call to action to us. And the notion of how do we reimagine and how do we act towards that is something that goes beyond the election. And, we need to defeat Donald Trump, but we need to actually move beyond that to a more equitable society and to actually do the kind of work to get there. And it does give me hope watching the work we have collectively done to change not only the narrative, but the perception about public education and what's needed. And we're going to have to do that more and more as a union about the economy, which is part of the reason why we wanted you to talk with us today in terms of the economic issues. We often outsource them to other people, and we need to be talking about the economic issues, the healthcare issues, more than just the education issues. As important to us as K-12 and post-secondary is, we have to talk about the broader economic issues, including how you change that power balance. So thank you, my friend. Thank you for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to all your members.
They're
who
amazing.
Do so much to keep America learning and healthy and safe.
Thank you. And with that, we had one, as I said to us when I started the convention, it feels like days ago, but when I started the convention of, I think it was just yesterday, I said one thing that I know will happen is that there will be mess-ups. And so we had a technical glitch before the conversation with Anand. We had, we have another video that Evelyn has taped earlier. I did tell you that it was her birthday, and her, and so she had actually taped a welcome video for us, which was not the Puerto Rican video. The Puerto Rican video was going to be played later on in the convention. So I want to make sure that Evelyn and others are watching. And before I go to the Speaker of the House of Representatives, who will be with us momentarily, and I will introduce the HEROES Act in a minute when I introduce her, I'd like to just quickly go to the video that Evie has taped. Now, I want people to know it's not just Evie's birthday, but Evie was one of the people who has survived COVID. And it's been really, really, really tough. And I'm so glad that she's with us in video today.
Hello, AFT sisters and brothers. I am Evelyn DeJesus, and it is my great privilege and honor to speak to you as your Executive Vice President. Today, I'd like to talk about our brothers and sisters in Puerto Rico and how, in the AFT, we care, we fight, and we show up for these members. We showed up after hurricanes in 2017. We showed up after the earthquakes early this year. And now we are fighting together in this COVID pandemic. As a proud Puerto Riqueña from New York City, I must tell you, the island is very close to my heart. I have been on the ground with our AFT president, Randy Weingarten, with our fellow union members in the Asociación de Maestros de Puerto Rico.
You're not alone, no estás sola.
With their wonderful previous president, Doña Aida Diaz, and with their new president, my sister, Elba Aponte Santos. I have witnessed their pain and their tears, but I've also witnessed their determination to thrive despite disaster. The AFT stood with the AMPR during the ongoing political and economic crisis as a corrupt Secretary of Education closed hundreds of schools and tried to charterize the rest. You know about Operation Agua, which delivered more than 100,000 water filters to schools and communities after Hurricane Maria. While President Trump made a big show of tossing out paper towels, we made sure that every single school could provide clean, healthy drinking water. Working with the AFL-CIO, AFT members were part of hundreds of nurses and other volunteers who flew to Puerto Rico to aid with relief efforts. If the labor movement hadn't stepped up in Puerto Rico, nothing would have been done. Then the earthquakes hit, and as the Trump administration continued to ignore this massive disaster and the devastation it caused, we reached out to AMPR, asking what they needed. And just 5 days later, the AFT was there. No one had a plan to open the schools until we bought tents to use as temporary classrooms. No one had a plan to take care of emotionally distraught kids who were displaced by the earthquakes until we worked with First Book to bring them books so they had something to do during this time. Now, Puerto Rico is suffering from the pandemic, and yet again, the government in San Juan or Washington, D.C. fails to care and show up for the people. We are the ones sending masks, face shields, and other PPEs for nurses and teachers. However, the island's problems didn't all come from hurricanes, earthquakes, and COVID. For decades, Puerto Ricans have faced horrible economic hardships from poorly funded public health and public education systems, housing, and other public services. The pandemic has made everything much worse. Thousands of people are still waiting for checks on flood damage claims from Hurricane Maria over 2 years ago. You may know the old joke, when the mainland sneezes, the island catches a cold. The economic turmoil here has sent unemployment rates through the roof. Since President Trump doesn't think Puerto Ricans are Americans, CARES funds have been very slow to reach our fellow citizens. As they plan for the new school year, students, teachers, and families face enormous obstacles. If Puerto Rico were a state, it would be the poorest in the Union, where close to 40% of homes do not have adequate broadband access for distant learning. However, AFT and AMPR will stand strong with students as they struggle to overcome economic, technological, and social barriers. We're not going away. The pandemic has put our entire country in turmoil, and as we rebuild, we must think about the consequences of the decisions we make. It is the moment where we must either invest in our future or forfeit it. We have to decide whether we prioritize public services for all of our communities here on the mainland and in Puerto Rico, or whether we saddle everything with more debt. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you about a place and a people so close to my heart. Gracias y Dios te bendiga.
Thank you, Evelyn. And I hope a lot of people are texting you happy birthday. And we have another person who I want to introduce. And we have within the Democratic Party a whole lot of, as the Speaker staff had just heard, we have a whole lot of viewpoints about what to do and how to get things done. And she knows that I have said this to her in countless meetings. I am a student of history, and I was a teacher of social studies. And there's actually no one, in my judgment, who has actually gotten more done in the complicated ways that government operates, whether you have the polarization, the deep polarization we have today, or in the history of polarization we've had in the country. There's no one who gets things done as much as Speaker Nancy Pelosi in her first speakership and now in her second speakership. And as I said, frankly, in my speech yesterday, Madam Speaker, that you did your job in terms of the HEROES Act. You also brought the first COVID relief package and the second COVID relief package and tried to make the third COVID relief package that was Mitch McConnell's giveaway better and fairer. But you did your job in May to try to get us the resources we needed to reopen schools safely. And they are still dithering, and they are still scoffing, and they are still undermining. But I want to say to all of our members that are watching, we have no better friend and no more effective advocate in terms of how we move policy than the Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I will accept your kind words on behalf of our very diverse and beautiful House Democratic Caucus. And yes, we do have various exuberances within our party. But as I say to the members, our diversity is our strength. Our unity is our power. And let me just say happy birthday to Evelyn. I'm so glad I got to see the film for whatever scheduling reason. Reminded me of being with you, Madam President, in Puerto Rico when you were addressing the convention there and hearing and seeing firsthand not only the challenges, but what AFT was bringing to the people and the students and the teachers of Puerto Rico. I consider myself probably the president of your fan club, but I know other people will compete for that honor to see you in Puerto Rico, to see you virtually, to see you actually in California, across the country, in DC, advocating for the children, their teachers, their families, their healthcare givers is just a joy to behold. You're an inspiration. You give me hope. And I thank you for that. I want to.
We compete with each other because I think I am the head of your fan club.
Well, I thank you for participating in we had the 100 Days town meeting the other day on Sunday. And again, it's always an honor when you join our virtual communication with the world. Thank you for doing that once again.
So what I would like to do, so there's thousands of people, our delegates are watching, this has also been live streamed. There's been this week, this craziness in terms of the Congress. It's almost like I'm not quite sure whether Mitch McConnell actually has a position on what to do in terms of COVID recovery. I'm not sure that they can put anything together. What's the state of play right now? And frankly, for all of our members who know that they're not going to be able to have schools, Dr. Fauci told us yesterday, even he and others have said, if we don't get the resources or if we don't actually have the safeguards in schools, how do we open them for kids? And I'm talking about areas that don't have a surge. I'm talking about areas that don't have soap, that don't have open windows. So what's going on in terms of the HEROES Act right now, and what can we do to help you help us?
Well, first of all, thank you for your leadership for our children. As I have said, I want to extend my condolences for the more than 200 members of AFT who have already lost their lives to COVID. It's really so sad, so heartbreaking. As we mourn the passing of John Lewis, I say it's a death in the family for us in Congress. But he would say, and has said to me while we were in the last conversations, there's a death in the family of nearly 150,000 American people because of the coronavirus. And that just did not have to happen. So here we are. 10 weeks ago today, we passed the HEROES Act. It is a bill that, again, has three main pillars. One, honor our heroes, our healthcare workers, our teachers, our first responders, our sanitation workers, our food suppliers, our transit workers, all the people who make the system run, many of whom, as you have done, have risked their lives in this crisis. and now they may lose their jobs. And so we have our first pillar, honor our heroes, so that state and local government can retain the people who are providing these services, many of them teachers. Secondly, open our economy, open our schools, but you cannot do it unless you destroy the virus. And that costs money. And we have a strategic plan, which we have had for a long time, but once again, even with more money, for testing, tracing, treating, social distancing, wear the mask, sanitation, and the rest. There's a plan. It's right there. It will save lives. Third is to put money in the pockets of the American people. And that is one of the fights we're having right now, over the $600, which we think is pathetic of them to resent somebody getting $600. They said, well, we know some people may stay home from work with the $600. And I said, well, you add it up. You have data, I have data. You want to say how much you think that we're losing because somebody's staying home from work? Let me compare that to how much we're losing, but because people are abusing another part of the COVID recovery money that is out there in bigger doses to big business and the rest.
It's like, I just want to interrupt you there for a second, because how do you sit in a room with people who say that to you? Like, how do you, you know, we've been asking people a lot, like, how do you have hope in this time? But how do you sit there without wanting to throttle somebody? Who says that?
Even worse, because I want to come back to school.
Okay,
but
sorry.
Even worse, I said to them yesterday, I said, millions of children in our country are food insecure. Families don't know how they're going to put food on the table. So it's just that one thing, you think you would support food stamps, the SNAP program, WIC, Women, Infant, and Children, initiatives for food security for our country. Just fake it that you care about people in this one place, because I myself cannot understand who you are if you don't understand we have to feed the hungry in our country and the children in our country. They said, well, we think we should give money to food banks. I said, well, more people are going to food banks than ever thought they'd ever go, except to volunteer, but now to eat. And they're under donated to for a variety of reasons as well. So that's the one that gets me. Feed the children? No. So I say this very clearly. And I said this to my members a couple of days ago. The position that the Democrats and the Republicans are taking on the COVID-19 legislation, the coronavirus legislation, the HEROES Act, shows the big difference that exists between Democrats and Republicans. They're there for the special interest and let it trickle down. If something does, that'd be good. If it doesn't, so be it. That's the free market. Versus the Democrats, who are the bubble up party. How do we meet the needs of America's working families? How do we do it? By putting money in their pockets at a time of this economic stress? How do we address the disparity and how the coronavirus is affecting communities of color and economically disadvantaged areas in a much more horrible way? And how do we say? How do they say, which they've said, we're not doing state and local, and we're saying, yes, you are. You just don't know it yet. You have to. Right. And what do you want? These people to be fired and then go on unemployment insurance? And is that saving you any money? And what is it doing to the needs of our children? But my three issues, people ask me, what do you think the three most important issues are in the Congress? I always say the same thing. For over 30 years, I've said the same thing. Our children, our children, our children. Their health, their education, the economic security of their families, a safe, and that means gun safety, gun-safe environment, a clean environment in which they can succeed, thrive, in a world at peace in which they can succeed. It's always about the children, and no one cares more about the children than our teachers, our custodians, our healthcare workers who minister to their needs. So here we are. They come out with this plan. When we had $100 billion in our plan, we knew it wasn't enough, but we had to get a bill passed. And I said to Randy, you'll be there in the negotiation at the table with us when we try to get more money. Well, they came in and said, we've met you and we've added $5 billion more. Well, here's what they do, though. In their money, which is really a hell of a nerve, if you'll pardon my French.
Yeah.
They have 105. 5 goes to governors, okay. 70 goes to K through 12. 29 goes to higher education, and $1 billion goes to Native American governments, et cetera. But of the $70 billion, 20 billion go to all schools, public and private, some distribution. 7 goes to private, just private, and then $46 billion goes to help schools which are reopening actually only. Is that, I mean, what are they thinking?
Yeah.
You think they'd say safety first.
Yep.
Now let's back up from there. How do we use our resources to open our schools safely with actually distance learning, hybrid, whatever it is? But what could they be thinking to say that half of the money we're giving, you're not getting unless you are opening actually more than half. It's 46 of the 70.
Yeah.
Again, 7 of it going to private schools exclusively. So it's a Betsy DeVos plan.
I was going to say,
and
it's not.
DeVos,
Yeah.
She said children should take risk, astronauts take risk. And how about the press person at the White House said, we cannot let science stand in the way of education and sending kids to school. So this is about health. There's an answer. Testing, tracing, treating, distancing. There's an answer. And there's a way to open the school. It takes money, but money spent the right way. And that means the health of the children, the health of the teachers, custodians, health, whoever else is involved in opening our schools actually virtually.
And we still need that money for schools that can't open in person initially, like in your city of San Francisco, in LA, in Houston, Atlanta. We need money for digital equipment. We need money for kids who don't have. We need money for connectivity. We need money for the PD to make remote better. We need money for, for food insecurity. And so this whole notion of luring by money as opposed to ensuring the health and safety, it's cockeyed. And this notion, as you just said, of science, which is how you open, which is how you tackle a virus. When did it become the obstacle? I mean, I'm a social studies teacher, I know that. So but how, so what can, and I know we have to leave soon and whatever, but what, I know long term, and I want to make sure our members see this, just like you said, you were in Puerto Rico, you've been in these hotspots, you've walked the walk with us. We've seen that for the last 2 years in terms of or the last year and a half in terms of what the House has done, the George Floyd Policing Act, H.R. 1, the work in terms of trying to make sure that unions, that working people can actually negotiate, can actually have more power, all the prescription drugs, so many of the policies that frankly, we just talked about in the earlier session, you actually have passed out of the House of Representatives. So I know this is top of the mind right now, but what would happen if you had partners in government? Like what would happen if Joe Biden got elected, or if, the Senate, that Chuck Schumer became the majority leader because there were more, a majority of Democratic senators? What would tell our members what would happen if you had some partners?
Well, let me first say, before we leave the Heroes Act, that Bobby Scott, our chairman of Education Labor Committee, whom you know well, and who admires you so much, He has basically said, if you want to help the schools, you have to help state and local government, because that's where most of the money comes from. So that's one of the fights that we're having with them now. They don't want to do that. But so the money for schools is one piece of it.
Yep.
But that's the federal piece. But the state and local piece is over 90% of it.
Absolutely.
And they want to diminish that. They don't believe in governance, and they don't believe in science. So if they don't care about science so that teaches them something, then they don't have to do anything about it. And that's great, because they don't believe in doing anything about it.
And we didn't, let me just also say, and we didn't take the bait of them saying 105, it's over the 100, therefore you should be grateful. We said, yeah, let's see what the poison pills are. And one of the poison pills is the absence of any state and local funding, as well as this diversion of more than a disproportionate share to the private schools. But so
your friend Chuck Schumer has us up to like $400 billion now.
Yes, he does.
Thanks to you. He said to them, he's been saying to them, that was 10 weeks ago.
Yep.
That didn't take into consideration opening the schools. It didn't take into consideration the spread of the virus, because the fact is, opening up schools is related to how you contain the spread of the virus in certain communities. So he's been out there. He said it was one then, it's now $400 billion now.
And because of all the child care money that we need as well. So it's, K-12, the higher ed, and the child care money.
Well, just on the floor, I just spoke on the floor on the child care, saying that's transformative. People cannot go to work if they don't have anybody to take care of the children. And our slogan in San Francisco is children learning, parents earning. They go together. Now, I have a granddaughter in public school in San Francisco. I have a son-in-law who teaches in public school in Arizona. So I have it from the teacher side and from the student side. Concern among classmates or fellow teachers is it going to be safe? I'm very worried about my son-in-law. He teaches children with disabilities, and he has a passion for it, and he wants to get back. But as you know, in Arizona, some teachers died, not even in communication with students, but just trying to make sure the classroom was ready.
No,
okay,
Arizona,
so 97 days from now, America will engage in the peaceful transfer of power, of which we are very proud in our democracy. Anybody who tells you that there's not a big difference between Democrats and Republicans hasn't spent a day in the Congress of the United States. The vast difference, the chasm between us, and it's like the difference between, Toynbee talked about it. There are some, in the study of civilization and societies are formed, some are there for the flowering of the whole society so that everyone can succeed, and others are there just for the power and the money.
Exactly.
And when those exist in the same society, it causes a schism of the political soul. That's what we have now, a schism between the Democrats and the Republicans. So when we win on Election Day, and we must do, I don't know if I'm allowed to say anything political here.
Yes, you can. With us, you can.
From a constitutional standpoint, when the peaceful transfer of power takes place that day, it is essential that we'll hold our house and grow our number. In doing so, we want to win the Senate, because it's very important, not only for policy and budget, but also for the courts, because you see what they've done packing the courts with attitudes, and then, of course, to win the Electoral College to elect Joe Biden President of the United States. Meanwhile, with all of this, 6 months ago, we never heard of coronavirus. 3 months ago, we never heard of George Floyd, bless his heart, we miss him. And a couple of weeks ago, we lost our John Lewis. So there's a lot going on, and this negotiation where our values are so completely different in terms of who we are here to serve, the special interest or the people's interest. That's just the way it is. But we don't agonize, as you and I say to each other all the time, we don't agonize, we organize, and you know what else? We unionize.
Exactly.
Because that will have the biggest difference in ending the disparity of income and equity in our country is if we can continue to organize in a way for collective bargaining, for safety in the workplace. Well, you know the list better than I, but that is essential.
I want to say something to you and to those who are still watching, who may have watched the last panel. The one thing you do, which is it's not just about seeing the differences between Democrats and Republicans. It's that the bills that you were actually able to whip and get passed, because you have quite, there's a big difference in your conference in terms of, and the overwhelming nature in which you have gotten these bills passed. They do rewrite the rules. They do change the power balance. They do. H.R. 1 will create a more fair democracy if we can get that through the Senate. The George Floyd policing bill will create more equity and will attack racial discrimination. The bills about unions and having that balance of power. And part of what I think we also have to do is we have to be better explainers about how the kind of work in government can rewrite the rules. But the work that you have done, and I've watched it this year, if we could get those things passed, that would change power balance so that workers and working families had more, not just more power, but a better life than they have right now.
I appreciate you saying that. Let me just say, whatever the differences of opinion we have in our caucus, they're very, very small compared to the difference between Democrats and Republicans in the Congress. And it is, and actually, I say to Republicans, take back your party. This isn't who you are. This is a cult. This is a very damaging group of people who really don't believe, again, in science, don't believe in governance, and really don't care. They just really don't care. But let's just say this, that's their problem.
Right.
Our hope is, and our opportunity is in the beautiful diversity of America. They're afraid, these people, some of them here, they're afraid of newcomers. They're afraid of people who don't look like them. They're afraid of diversity. They're afraid of women. They're afraid of LGBTQ. Because they have their own insecurities, that's their problem. We don't agonize, we organize, we unionize, and we will win. But we all have to get out the vote. People have to understand that. And whether you're Democrat or Republican, make sure whoever you vote for knows what you care about, so that not only is your voice heard by your vote, but by your views are made known to those in office, so they know if they want your support, they have to respect your concerns. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being with us today.
I'm honored to be with you always. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your extraordinary leadership. I know you personally. I know your parents. I know your wife. I see you personally. I see you politically. I see you organizationally. I never want to follow Randy on the platform. She's just too dazzling. So thank you all, to all of your members, to each and every one of you. Thank you for
being with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And that, my friends, was Nancy Pelosi. And I know we are running out of time. And so we have a video from Chuck Schumer, which I would like to play. And then we're going to adjourn until 2:30. But thanks, everybody, for this morning. And remember what I said, in a virtual conference, there is going to be something that messes up technologically, but thank you for being with us and giving me that grace to be able to do mix and match and be a little bit later than we thought. And with that, I'll see you all at 2:30. Let's play the video from Senator Schumer.
Hello, AFT. This is Senator Chuck Schumer, and I hope first all of you are healthy and safe during your 86th biannual convention. Thank you to my dear, dear friend. She's like a sister to me, and that is your president, Randy Weingarten. We've known each other for 40 years as we both climbed up the ladder in New York. And I want to thank Randy for giving me the opportunity to share a brief message. To every single member of the AFT, to every school worker, to every teacher, To everyone who's dedicated their life to public education, thank you, thank you, thank you for the work you do. My kids were educated in public schools in New York City. They got a great education, as did I. I'd not be sitting here talking to you if not for many dedicated teachers in New York public schools who helped me so much so along the way. And now, we're less than a month away before the school year begins, likely under the most difficult circumstances of our lifetimes. The disgrace of Donald Trump saying, you have to open or we're going to cut off funds. What planet is he living on? Hurting millions and millions of children, hundreds of thousands of teachers and education workers for his own petty, political, nasty agenda. When states opened too early a few months ago, it set off another stage of this disease, and we will not repeat that same mistake when it comes to our teachers and our students. To prepare for the fall, we need to make sure all of our schools have the resources they need to keep our teachers, our staff, and our students safe. And Senate Democrats are shoulder to shoulder with you. We will stand with you every single step of the way. I worked with Randy to put together the Cicera legislation, which Patty Murray and I have introduced. We're fighting hard to get it in a final COVID bill. We will work hard to make sure you have the funding, the technology, the PPP, and other supplies necessary to continue teaching our children without needlessly putting yourselves or your students in harm's way. As I speak to you right now, Democrats are hard at work making sure that Congress finally passes desperately needed COVID relief policies that we outlined in the HEROES Act, including funding for state and local governments to keep public service employees like teachers on the job, including help for the unemployed, for our hospitals, our medical workers. Sadly, our Republican colleagues can't seem to get it together. They'd rather help the big corporations. It's a shame that McConnell's number one thing he wants in this bill is immunity from big corporations when they put a worker's health in jeopardy. Disgraceful. And finally, to everyone who is working hard to bring change to our country this year, thank you, and we need you in the months ahead. I promise you that we will get through this pandemic together. Democrats will stand with you every step of the way. And until we can see each other again in person, may you all be safe and healthy wherever you may be. God bless the teachers. God bless this great union. And God bless the United States of America.
We want to make sure and see that the HEROES Act passed.
I'm really worried about school budget cuts in the coming year.
Fear is that there will be safety issues for our staff as well as our students.
Asking the Senate to pass the funding so we can go back in September.
Don't forfeit our future.
Pass the HEROES Act. Don't forfeit our kids' future.
I just hope they're hearing us.
Keep going. Keep going.